Hi, welcome to the XY Chromies, Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers discuss veteran issues, science, geopolitics, and everything in between. I'm your host, Pearson Guest, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Richard Ellis. How's it going today, Richard?
Good day, Paris. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Awesome. Well, today's episode is number 12, where they'll be covering a variety of topics in the quantum realm. But first, let's cover some good news. In a world dominated by sensational doom and gloom news, we felt it would be nice to start each show off covering good news story and sharing our thoughts. So with that, what do you got for us today, Richard?
I've got a story for you from Science News, independent journalism since 1921, so you know it's fresh. It's a little story about how physicists are measuring the Earth's rotation using quantum entanglement. I'll just do a little primer real quick on quantum entanglement. I know most people know what it means, but I had to refresh myself on it. In the simplest terms, quantum entanglement means that aspects of one particle of an entangled pair depend on aspects of the other particle of that entangled pair. So it's already confusing. So if you got two little bees and those two BBs spin one direction or the other, it means that one is dependent upon the other, no matter what way you look at it. That's kind of the idea. So these particles could be, for example, electrons or photons, and an aspect could be the state it is in, such as whether it's spinning in one direction or another. The strange part of quantum entanglement is that when you measure something about one particle in the entangled pair, you immediately know something about the other particle, even if they are millions of light years away. Okay, so that's quantum entanglement. There's no way you could explain quantum entanglement in 2 paragraphs. I just attempted it. So, physicists measured Earth's rotation using quantum entanglement. The feat is a step toward probing one of the biggest mysteries of physics: how the tiny world of quantum physics interfaces with gravity. Scientists sent a pair of photons, which are light particles, through a device called a quantum interferometer. Big words here.
That's a mouthful.
Inside, the photons could traverse loops of optical fiber either clockwise or counterclockwise. The photons were entangled with one another, a type of quantum correlation that links the states of two particles. In this case, the entanglement meant the two photons took the same path, and rather than picking one direction or the other, the pair took on a strange state called superposition, traversing a combination of the two paths. Due to Earth rotating underneath the two different paths, here we go, because it's on Earth, they're not in space, the two different paths correspond to slightly different travel distances. This made the photons two superposed components slightly out of sync when they exited the labyrinth, causing quantum interference. Measuring that interference implied a rotation. All right. What does any of that mean?
Yeah, explain that in detail, Richard. Get on that.
If I think that I've only ever seen these marble games at the dentist office or maybe like a pediatrician's office.
Are you talking about the ones
So
you
maybe
tilt, that you hold and you tilt?
No, this is the one. It's not a marble. I should call it a bead, but there's a bead.
Okay.
With a wire guide threaded through it, and the wire guide takes a path and it moves along, a ripple. It does some spirals, but there's like 5 or 6 of these wire frame paths. They're stuck to a board. We're gonna have to get a picture of this too.
Yeah.
Put it up on the video, but you've seen it at the dentist's office, and if you take one of the beads, you can move the bead along that path.
Yeah.
Imagine these two photons are 2 beads on identical looking paths on that board. So what you do is you begin moving the beads, and if your act of moving them is subject to the Earth's rotation, one bead, even though they start at the same point, will not end at the same point on that wireframe path.
Okay.
So if you're in the audience, go ahead and get a dentist appointment. But while you're there, make sure they have this wireframe thing with beads on it. Then while you're waiting for the dentist, perform your own quantum entanglement experiment. And you'll understand what I just read.
Well,
So
this leads to a lot of interesting discussions we can have around um, quantum mechanics, I suppose. Something that I'm always interested in, but really know very little about. Um, in fact, I've been recently having generally philosophical conversations with a person at the dog park that shows up pretty early, also. So we walk in circles and talk everything from his startup to philosophy, morals, and we've really been getting into it, like talking about time a lot lately. And he's kind of, I would say, Robert Sapolsky, deterministic minded, like everything is predetermined, all
mhm.
actions and stuff. So then what is morality? What is evil? Those are tough questions for him. And we've debated those topics. But specifically, when we talk about time, he posited that time is an illusion or an abstraction that we use
Yeah.
uh, to make sense of the change of different quantum states, right? And and so moreover, to bolster his argument, I would say I read an article recently that a couple PhDs someplace really smart wrote a paper saying that time was an illusion, basically backing up his theory, um, and saying that time was an illusion, um, and it's an abstraction that we use to mark because everything within the universe is entangled. And so the idea is that every single thing is quantumly entangled within the universe. And so therefore we see the passage of time to make sense of the changed state of those entanglements. But to an outside observer, everything would look still because they would be measuring it, right? The outside observer to the universe. Um, I know that's pretty heavy, but frankly, level to put a bow in it, I disagreed with that because I was like, well, I think time would be the outside observer. If there's anything that precedes the universe, it would most likely be time. Like I'm not a religious person, nor am I very certain of any larger, greater being. But if there were a good argument that I would put forth, if I had to argue on that side or steel man the idea of God,
Hmm.
it would probably be time. Time is actually the God of the universe. So I argue it's intrinsic to the universe, fundamental. It's intrinsic as electron spin is intrinsic to, as gravity is to the universe. It's a fundamental property, I would say. But we can go down that path. But that's been some of our debates have been really getting out there, going into the philosophy of time. So,
The basis of all human philosophical discussion is people arguing over two polar ideas about a subject for which they know nothing about, and they're completely wrong on the two polarities. And so then we create a foundation for stacking incorrect assumptions on top of incorrect assumptions. So it's incorrect assumptions all the way down.
and yet somehow we've progressed this far and done so much with incorrect assumptions. So I guess we broken clock it. We're right
Yeah,
twice a day,
totally.
and somehow
Yep.
we've made it this far without exploding or extincting ourselves. So
A great many more uh, a great many more times in scientific discovery has someone said, "Well, that was unexpected," and not "Eureka, it worked." No one says that. Those Nobel prizes go to people who initially said, "Well, that was unexpected," because they happened to discover something that did not fit their previous assumptions at all.
yeah, and then sometimes they do get it right. The predictions that we've landed before we had observation. That Galileo and Newton and so
Mm-hmm.
many others, Einstein, were able to figure out before we had any way of confirming a lot of what they were theorizing. So, yeah, it's what you're describing to me, and what I think probably governs our universe is the combination of deterministic and probabilistic physics. Newtonian or Einstein's theories of relativity. That's the deterministic side of physics, whereas we have a complete quantum probabilistic side of physics, where things can be entangled. We don't know properties of them until we observe and measure them, and then we can start to deduce properties about them. So, but everything's on a slider scale. I mean, this is my basic understanding of quantum, is like it's the probability of things. I guess if I could, probably miscategorize it, but yeah. So
Keep in mind that we're using a biological structure, a brain and sensing features that evolved on the savannas of Africa or Southwest Asia to be effective at what do they call that? The process of hunting where you just follow something until it becomes too exhausted to flee anymore. I think it's
uh,
exhaustion hunting.
yeah, I don't know. Yeah,
Literally that
using
is
our
the thing.
stamina and out
Yes,
staminaing. Yeah,
there you go. And so uh, persistence hunting, I think is what it's called, or something like that. And we're using this equipment that evolved in those locations on the planet to sense and understand cosmic ideas that are vastly outside of the realm of that operational beginning. So
yeah.
one of the when you start getting into the real esoterics of what is matter, just trying to answer that question from a philosophical perspective, the tall weeds couldn't be taller, because at some point what you're left with is the way that our brain interprets signals from our sensory systems. It essentially is creating a hologram or some representation of those sensory signals, and what it's interpreting is through that filter. So we're not getting the full experience. In fact, now that we know what the electromagnetic spectrum looks like, we're not getting the full experience from our eyes for sure. We're just getting a tiny tap on that. And um, there's just so much to say about how, when we investigate the natural world, it's why we have to come to a consensus on what everybody's observing, because each individual observer is getting their own subjective experience from that observation and their own specific hologram. And so the best thing we have is the combination of all the holograms, or all the superimposed shadows that we all see on the back of the cave wall, to get an idea that's consensus.
Well, and I think that's a perfect segue too, because you also are highlighting a problem from just the network effect as well. Because not only do
Mm-hmm.
we need to get a consensus from the people around us, seeing the same shadows on the wall, but we need to break free from our own little bubbles of who we talk to, of our own little
Mm-hmm.
environment, and talk to other bubbles. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because there's probably somebody who just came into the cave and is trying to tell all of us that are looking at the shadows that that's not the world we know, and there's a greater world out there, and we should probably listen to what he has to say, and not um, cast stones at him or call him crazy, call them crazy, or whatever. This is a reference to Plato's cave allegory, because Richard mentioned it just there, and so I figured
Mm-hmm.
I would expand upon it a little bit. But yeah, as my mic went flying, so
I would assume that I've already talked about this in this forum, but that's the best part about my brain, is that I forget what I've talked about, and I forget what anybody's told me. So it's all new every day.
same here.
It's the idea of frames and the idea of frameworks, and that in in physics we can talk about a frame as being a frame of reference for a set of conditions such as velocity, the speed that we're going, and some other parameters. And then when we observe something that's in a separate frame, what we're doing is comparing the differences between the two frames. So we might be on a platform that's traveling 25 kilometers per hour, and we observe something that's on a platform traveling 25 kilometers per hour parallel to us. It's not diverging in its path, it's going the same speed, and then we would look at that platform and say, oh, that's the same thing. Even though it's totally not, and under special circumstances, it could diverge either in velocity or direction. And so when we're looking at things that are not on a platform going the same direction and velocity, then we have all these interpretations about that other platform. So those are frames of reference in physics.
Yeah.
And with regard to how human beings behave and how we go through our lives and make decisions, we also use a framework. We use a frame that defines, inside of that frame is all of the lexicon of words that we can use to describe what's in our frame and describe to someone else what's in our frame, describe to ourselves and someone else. So that entire quantity of words, that total lexicon that we have, is not just a theoretical limitation upon us. It is a actual limiting quality to what we can do with our lives. And so one of the most challenging things that I confronted as I've worked on myself and done this trauma recovery project has been to, one, observe that there's a frame, to know that it exists, and that within that frame, that's how I've been operating for the majority of my life. And then two, that the language that I use inside the frame is what keeps it closed. But if I begin to use language that's outside of that frame, that is beginning to put perforations into the frame and allows me to see outside of it and see other possibilities. So this idea of frames works really well for having a conversation about seeing things differently and then changing because of those differences. Now, some people are perfect; they don't need to change, and they know who they are.
Yeah.
I noticed that I was not perfect. And that my frame was limiting me. There were things I was trying to accomplish that I could not accomplish, I couldn't go forward with. And it's only been in the last 5 years where that frame has begun to degrade in its rigidity and to become more porous and to let new ideas in and new lexicon in.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was funny. That's one of the things that I've realized, and I was having a discussion recently about this as well, was the person I was talking to kept saying, well, everyone's got their delusions, right? He was using this as a justification for, what we were talking about. And I was like, okay, sure, we can say that, I typically refrain from using everyone or absolutes in any case, because just, the idea of nuance and spectrum, and I don't think everybody is the same, people are unique and individual. It's part of the grand experiment that we are, and that we do have things that are similar, frames that overlap with other people's frames, I would say, or are in alignment. And then we have ones that are completely out of the box, or, completely in a different realm, maybe even a different plane of existence, depending on where you put a frame, if we're putting it up on 2-dimensional space on a wall or something, or however we want to go about it spatially. So it's really important to, what I thought about that, I was like, okay, well, yeah, people can have their delusions, but to me, a delusion is something that, despite being confronted with, evidence to the contrary of your, past view, belief, ideology, whatever, that's being your delusion, you decide to continue to believe that when presented that evidence. That's when I think what a delusion is. And so the best way to combat that is through maintaining a curious mind, which would be a porous or dynamic frame, right? Which allows you to absorb new information and change your lexicon, right? At the end of the day, the funny thing is we're limited by the lexicon of words that exist today, but you and I know that new words come out every year. They're put into Webster's dictionary, and the Germans are known for creating tons of words every year. Actually, it's really quite interesting, the process of how they go about that, and some of the words and their meaning, and some funny ones. I remember learning about this during the COVID time, because they had come up with a specific number of new words related to pandemics, viruses, and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
there was a conversation I was having with a faculty member at the end of last term, and I would say that the theme to this conversation, which is one that we've had multiple times, has been um, the disparity of the performance of the students in her class versus her expectations. And we could say that she would be prone to bias, given that her experience in academia spans 5 decades. So it'd be really easy for her to have remembered just kind of cherry pick some memories about people's performance in the past.
Of course.
And it's one of the first times that I really, for my own purposes of learning the content of my own degree program, that it occurred to me in this conversation that she sets out lecturing on the topics of thermodynamics and spring force and vibrational analysis and so forth with language that, her lexicon is a gigantic grain silo of words that apply to these ideas about how things degrade over time and how thermal systems work and how fluid moves in pipes and all these different ideas about physics. And her students show up with a purse full of lexicon about these ideas. They've got a bag of holding, and they got a small satchel. And so what she tries to do every term is put this galaxy brain of words about the physics of how something works in a fluid system into a small bag. I guess that's the analogy I'm using. But not only into a small bag, we could even take the analogy a little farther and say a small bag that has actual receptacles for words and sounds.
Mm-hmm.
And she's trying to put words and sounds in the bag that doesn't have receptacles for them.
Yeah.
So they don't even fit. Even if you cram them in there, they don't fit. And when I reflect back on some of the most despairing times that I repeated a class multiple times, it had a lot to do with the idea that I was confronting a new a new topic area, a new subject matter, but more than just that I was seeing some new math and new fun, exciting ways to use calculus, it was more than that. It was that the lexicon of the class was outside of my experience. And I hadn't devoted any time to learning I hadn't gone to the back of the glossary and looked at all the words that we're going to be using for the term.
Yeah.
It's these things where I was letting it hit me in the face, but never really I was not adding it to my own silo of words and sounds to use when talking about the topic. Of course, now, that class is long behind me and I have that lexicon to work with. But that seems to be the problem every term. New people walk into a classroom, unless they're me and they're taking it for the third time. New people walk into the classroom, the lecture begins, and the first thing we do is use a bunch of pretty alien-sounding words. And at some point I raise my hand and I ask why there are letters in the math, because why are there letters being used in math problems, right? That's my classic question. And that's outside of my lexicon as well. To me, math is four-function calculator mathematics. I don't know anything about an alpha or what's this omega symbol? Why are these things going in there?
Oh, the American education system.
Exactly. I didn't get a classical Greek education before I went to college.
So what's so funny, I'm thinking of a professor, my circuits professor, speaking of a class that has an entirely new lexicon of ideas thrown at someone.
Mm-hmm.
That was me learning about electricity and circuits for the first time was extremely foreign. So I can relate to what you were feeling in that. I rode my finishing of math before I showed up to our college pretty hard at that class. Luckily, I had finished all the math requirements for the whole class.
Mm-hmm.
But on that note, What was funny to me most was when the instructor was explaining the math that would be required to go through. I believe it was circuits 2 at the time, and it was going to require linear algebra, of course. Uh, and half of the student body was in linear algebra because they said you could take the class,
Yeah.
together. Like that would help, right? Which it does. I mean, talk about a brutal transition if you haven't taken linear algebra before.
Hmm.
Um, and he was so shocked. I should say he's from Syria. This is important to the story. So he
Yeah.
he goes, "What are you talking about? You guys haven't taken linear algebra yet." He's like, "You take that in like what, eighth or ninth grade?" He threw that out, and everyone in the class, of course, starts laughing, and
Yeah.
losing their absolute, they're like, yeah, right. They're all hooting and hollering. Half of the class was in linear algebra, as I said before. And he was in shock, you know. This is a country that is literally war torn in a civil war right now. I laugh because, I mean, only at the irony of him being so shocked at the failure of our math education that's happening right now. Um, so yes, what you said there makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure a lot of people. I think one thing more to say on the math side specifically, it's one of those things that the really I hear most people get frustrated with math as a subject more than probably anything. They always highlight math, and when
Yeah.
they fell out of love with it, some
Hmm.
teacher either didn't teach it in a way that made that person understand, or for whatever reason. But there's always this class that ends the relationship with math with a person, and um, I think typically it's about a certain teacher who comes down to a teacher who didn't teach it right. By this is the student's words.
Hmm.
And usually what that means to me is that they didn't have an alternative way of teaching the math that they were teaching at that time, which is really sad because it's a reflection on our math teachers or like the education that they were afforded maybe
Hmm.
necessarily, especially depending on the state that they are teaching in and the resources that they were provided. So, um, because I understand that sometimes math needs to be taught different ways to different students for them to absorb that subject specifically. And it's just such a vital subject, specifically tied to your income directly. Your ability
Yeah.
to get through math can have a pretty adverse or beneficial result to your paycheck. So,
You know, I I want to say it was circuits two. I know that our curriculum has changed since I started and since you went through, and so I don't know exactly what term and what part of the term you started working with phasers in circuits, but it was the part of circuits where you're doing a lot of conversion between linear and polar notation,
yes.
and I I disassociate during that period of the class. I don't take any more notes. I just sit there and check out, and I didn't learn that part from the lecture and couldn't demonstrate it on the homework or the exams.
This
It
is
was
around when AC is being introduced, delta Y
Yep,
transitions. That's a
correct.
really tough class. It's a really tough,
Yep.
a bunch of new material is flooded at you in that class. Um, I think before that class, you're mainly operating within DC,
Yep.
and DC is
AC.
friendly when it comes to
Yeah, comparatively.
mathematically
So
friendly, I would say comparatively. Yes. Yes, I'm
so
remembering in that I think I disassociated a little bit during that period of time too. I'm because the pandemic was happening that class like literally just happening, and and I think I had a 2 month old. So yeah, that class was rough.
so the anecdote here is not necessarily that we're going to turn into a math podcast and begin diagramming polar to rectangular notation conversion functions. Let's not do that. But I do want to observe the following. after that term, and I didn't pass that course, I just had to put it sometime in my future and come back to it.
Mm-hmm.
I took a I went outside of our degree program and I took a drafting course or an AutoCAD course from the mechanical department. And so I install AutoCAD on my computer, go to class, get a picture of a thing, draw the thing in AutoCAD. And it's not the way that I draw things now in CAD. I have a totally different procedure for doing it now. It's my procedure, so it goes fast.
Mm-hmm.
But doing it their way meant that you learned how to define locations on a Cartesian plane.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want something to be a box that's going to involve the origin, and you want it to be 2 units per side, you might go out to 2, 2 in the
Mm-hmm.
Cartesian plane. So now you have you have that 2 units per side, and it's going to intersect the origin. So we did that for a week, and then we came back the next week, and now the new way of doing this was to design the same parts in AutoCAD, but do it with polar notation.
Oh
But
God.
we're given rectangular notation. So you probably already guessed I'm doing the same exact conversion math in the drafting class that I was doing in circuits.
You were like, I'm gonna go take a break from that because that was terrible, and it chased you down. It was like, no, that's not how this works, Richard.
And the other turns out here is because it was in a drawing class. I'm a much more I visual kinesthetic, and I'm given to artistic talents over
You go to your
mathematical
happy
talents.
place. I get it. Yes, happy place feelings around that medium.
Yeah, here I am. I'm learning how to draw in AutoCAD, which is a different kind of it's a mechanicalized way of drawing. It's a
Yeah.
mathematical way of drafting. And all of a sudden the math to do those rectangular to polar and back conversions went from being inscrutable to me
Mm-hmm.
and impossible to recall on an exam to being second nature.
Yeah, it just suddenly clicked because it was a different forum, a different mode. You were in a different state of being, a different state
Yeah.
of stress, and yeah, wow,
I
it's a
don't feel
perfect
the same type of
example of like
exactly. I don't feel
the
the same
different
type
way
of
of
pressure
math.
and
Yeah.
stress when I'm in a visual arts scenario as I do when we're talking about phasers and AC circuits, because that is an alien lexicon to me, but plots on a piece of paper that are going to manifest a part, that's totally within my lexicon. So I think you're absolutely right. There is going to be a population, a subset of the human population for whom, if you just show them math, they just get it. It just goes right into their brain. There's a receptor for it, and they just take it in. It's fine. And then there's some other group of people who have to work a little bit harder, but they get it too. And then there's the music and graphic arts math nerds who, as long as it's in a creative forum, as long as it's in a creative medium, they can do polar notation all day long.
I
And the minute you introduce it as an engineering concept for electrical engineering, they're like, I don't get this.
exactly. I mean, I'm reminded of The Office. Kevin Malone. There, I believe it's like the episode where they're trying to get pies. Jim's trying to do something nice for Pam, and they're
Mm-hmm.
in like the moving bus that Dwight has, fashioned, and uh, suddenly when pies are in the case, are on the line, Kevin starts doing really quick math on like how long it's going to take to get there, and Angela and Oscar are surprised. They're like, you can't do math that quick," and so on and so forth. So then they quiz him without pies at the end of it,
Yeah.
and he's like, "I have no idea." They're like, "What's 387 times whatever
Yeah.
thousand?" And he's like, "I don't know." And then they do the like, "Well, what's this pies?" And then he immediately has the answer. And what
Right.
you're describing is just like a different context. Suddenly, the learning happens. So yeah, I think, and so I mean, it's tough to go, oh, educators, more burden on you, have multiple ways. And I think that's typically an educator that's been in the system for long enough and not gotten beaten down. Hopefully they've been able to develop multiple ways of explaining the same concepts, basically, because I think that is really, that it's really important. It kind of describes the experience that you've had.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you realize with your kids too is you're trying to subject them to as many experiences safely, obviously, as you can, while they're developing, because you're trying to make that frame that you're describing porous and dynamic and able to adjust to the world as it comes. And so that, I think one of the differences between maybe why I didn't fail circuits 2, and you did, even though I felt all of the feelings that you were feeling about it being a foreign language, is because I had already finished literally Calculus 4, linear algebra, and I
Right.
had just finished them. Like, I had finished the math program at community college. I had transferred over. It was my second term. It was the thing I was riding on for physics and everything else. I was riding on my math because the physics concepts were really challenging to me. I wasn't understanding them as easily as I thought I would have. The chemistry was challenging, but the math was there as this like backbone that I could ride on. So all of the foreign lexicon stuff was still foreign, but it was bridged by things I was familiar with, which was the math. And to tie that back to what I was saying about your kids, you're trying to give them enough of fluid, flexible lexicon so that things that are unfamiliar, they might be able to draw some familiarity from that because they've had a variety of experiences that have allowed them to have this lexicon, and then this dynamic frame. So yeah.
The other, I guess, the corollary to that is what I would hope if I was to engineer my development, if I was to be able to go back and build me in a lab setting, is to give me the context base for these things. So a lexicon is just language. It's a language frame, and vocabulary is what makes up the lexicon. And maybe there's a lexicologist out there who says I'm getting it all wrong, and we'll be sure and email Pierce if you have problems with what I'm saying.
Just XY Chromies, as we'll take what is ours? It's XY Chromies cu@gmail.com. You can email us with suggestions, feedback. We will take it.
Corrections on Richard's definition of
Corrections
language.
on my definition that Richard has grafted upon me on. Is a lexicologist a thing? And do they work at a library? And is that in the library or historian track? I'm very curious.
I think that you and I might have a future. If we get tired of this engineering thing, we might have a place to go. Anyway, so the context that comes from having the large language to work with and the vocabulary to work with is what makes it easy to switch from graphic arts to music arts to mathematics to engineering and physics and through all these different medium, because it turns out they're just relying on very similar principles throughout. It's waveform theory all the way down. That's just it. And how you get the waveforms you're trying to work with and how you interpret the waveforms and manipulate the waveforms and transform the waveforms into something else and filter the waveforms and get highs and lows and mediums for the waveforms. This is all to do with the way that we have designed modern Western mathematics around these ideas. And so to me, it was a surprise to be in a drafting class using AutoCAD and using polar rectangular conversion math to someone else who understood what I just said. They're saying, yes, that's so what? What's new to that? How is that a surprise to you? Because they happen to have the foundational context that fits all these different applications. And so I don't know how you're going to do it, but you're going to give your kids experiences. And the way that I would do it if I could go back and work on me in the laboratory is I'd be looking for ways to build my context so that the new experiences weren't threatening.
Mm-hmm.
This is a central nervous system idea. This is how like I've talked about with polyvagal theory in the past, so that these new ideas weren't received to me as though they were threats or hazardous, that I felt safe learning them. So there's a key part of this with the way that I learned math and the way that math homework was treated in my home. It just was turned into a terrible hazardous experience.
Yeah.
It was unsafe to encounter numbers. And so I would change that, and I would look for ways to make the things that I would do naturally or out of impulses map onto mathematical descriptions. So I learned how to play keyboard when I was like in 8th grade. When our Syrian friend was learning linear algebra, I was learning how to play Elvis songs on a Casio keyboard.
Okay. I
So
I had
I don't know what his problem is.
Hey, I was I definitely liked the piano growing up. We had one in the house because my mom played church piano every Sunday. So
Right.
so I definitely grew up tinkling on the keys for sure.
But there's someone that mathematics and music are inextricably linked in the minds of people who know that they're inextricably linked.
Yeah.
They're not separate things. And the electronics that goes into audio processing and recording knows that that is inextricably linked with electronics and physics in the minds of people who know that. It was the gateway in for me happened to be with construction and building and making wooden objects, because I arrived at a point where I wanted to make a feature in my backyard. I had a surplus of lumber to work with for a reason I'll tell that story some other
And these
time.
pesky angles were getting in the way of things. Angles and lengths combined with other angles were probably being very annoying.
I mean, how hard is it to start at the bottom and work your way up and just finish with whatever height you end up with?
Ooh.
But I needed to finish at a specific height and work my way down. That's a different way of building.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to learn enough trigonometry to figure out what angles to cut the lumber to make the rafters, how long the rafters were going to be for making the roof, and then build from the roof down. Now that requires trigonometry and geometry to figure out. So by the time I finished that project, making that feature in my backyard, I was really ready to talk about things as sine, cosine, and tangent, and really ready to understand, like, everybody writes at the top of their trigonometry test, when they're doing their trig test, their trig midterm and trig final, they write SOHCAHTOA at the top of the paper. And then from that, they can rebuild their memory of what sine, what's adjacent to the hypotenuse and what's opposite the hypotenuse and what's right. You remember that? So if I approached trigonometry from that direction, nothing. It doesn't go in.
Yeah.
But if I need it as a tool to build the thing that I'm motivated to make, not only does it go into my brain, it has a place, it has a receptor, and it has a long-term storage proposition. And
I wonder if that's how Einstein was all the way through, because it sounded like when he was working on physics, he was always like, I got to learn more math to make the physics work. And he's over here trying to build his physical theories and properties. And he'd always have to hit up one of his math buddies at uni, at one of the neighboring universities. And he'd always be like, hey, so-and-so, you're working on theoretical geometry right now. I've got this space-time problem that my professor just gave me. He's saying I have to merge them together.
I'll take it as a nice form of compliment for you to compare me to Einstein, but I don't see the comparison myself.
No, I just mean that
right.
I think people get the misnomer that he was big into math. Like, I think a lot of times he's miscredited as being some math genius. And I won't say that he wasn't, but it was known that he didn't particularly like doing math, and he looked at it more as a vehicle to get the physics
Yeah,
done more
he
than
saw it as a
he
tool.
enjoyed it. Um, and famously, I don't know who said this, but it's been said, um, he would learn the amount of math he needed. Like that's how he went
Right.
about math. Like, which is the same method at which you were kind of approaching it, where maybe you needed more because your degree now requires it, but
Right.
you were learning what you needed when you're building. So, yeah,
When when you are as concrete of a thinker as me, and you need a tool, if that tool happens to be sine, cosine, and tangent, I'll learn the tool. But I would never pursue it. Back then, I would have never pursued it for its own purposes or its own elegance or its own practicality as a proof. That doesn't appeal to me at all.
you're describing why just learn to code didn't work with a bunch of coal miners who were being laid off or put out of work.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, just learning to code for the sake of coding and not having something to build towards.
Mm-hmm.
There's many times where I've, got Python and I'm like, I'm going to do some coding. I'm going to learn some coding without really any direction. And it's always run into walls. But, I start coming up with an application idea that I want to actually create myself. Then suddenly things start sticking a little bit better and I don't just have to start at hello world again. Um, uh, Similarly to, I think, CAD or Fusion for me,
Mm-hmm.
once I had an idea in my head that I wanted to put to paper, I started to learn pretty quickly, especially help with the help of your tutelage. And uh, but yeah, so once I had a purpose, learning the skill to get there, definitely, I was far more motivated. I think that a lot of people operate that way. So um, yeah, it's tough to without a end goal in mind.
So what we're talking about is very difficult to industrialize in the way that our education system is an industrialized or industrialization prep. We designed our entire education experience around this idea that we would have graduates from that education system being very capable of going to assembly lines and to factories and to production plants, and that they would be able to use the skills taught in these public school systems to do that type of work, which probably was the right thing to do in 1901. But as time has gone on, and as the level of sophistication of what a person can both learn in their lifetime and do in their career has changed since 1901, then necessarily an industrial style school process has completely fallen away as being of any efficacy for the majority of people who need it or could use it.
Yeah,
And
especially when we moved the
I
industrial plant out of here in the 1970s,
yeah,
and to everywhere else. Like, unironically, we actually are moving the industrial plant back, a lot back to the
right.
U.S. right now with the CHIPS Act and the IRA, and a couple other pretty aggressive policies as things heat up between us and China. Um, so, but a lot of this industrial plant is that require the on the ground worker, not necessarily more so the rebuilding of the American infrastructure that's occurring right now needs quite a few technicians that are well trained to work on the various um, renewable energy infrastructure that's popping up everywhere, the new
Mm-hmm.
natural gas infrastructure that's continuing to expand from our oil and gas industry. Um, yeah, there's quite a bit of work to be done, but definitely with the moving into the industrial plant and then the add of the tech sector, the need and biotech included, and so many other fields that just require the STEM fields as we know it that require such a higher level of education. We've really fallen behind and not quite learn to adapt our program properly. I, it feels like, and not to be the person who's like, oh, I've got an easy solution, but it feels like getting the teachers who teach various subjects to for each grade year to collaborate around a number of projects that would go throughout the year, and each teacher could tie their educational foray, for instance the math that's required, they would be writing about, maybe the students are building some pyramids or something, I don't know, like, and so that would be the theme for one student group, and therefore the history teacher would teach the history of the pyramids. They get the easy one, obviously. The math teacher would teach math with projects that were going around trigonometry or geometry, and so on and so forth. People could write papers about, the writing could be done, what you could read, and so on and so forth. So you create projects that the students could be inspired to complete. They could see a goal and a purpose, and therefore it would provide a vehicle to learn all these subjects that might not be appealing before. Create it's. It seems like that might be a good way of adjusting how teaching is done.
Before our conversation today, I had to rush back to my studio. I had a meeting with two faculty members and a student. The topic of the meeting was for us to learn more about a chemistry analyzer that's used in our medical lab science department laboratories. So medical lab scientists are the people who handle and examine and provide that provide the, not the diagnostics, but they provide the features of blood work, for example. So tomorrow I'm going to go to the oncologist, going to get blood work done. In about 45 minutes, the results are going to be back, and my oncologist will talk with me about these different levels of different parts of my what's in my blood. And
Yeah.
she would be looking for indicators of malignant cells in my bloodstream, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you get those indicators from the medical lab scientists who analyze it. So they provide the analysis. We teach those professionals at my university. So you might not have ever interacted with them while you're on campus, but this is a group of 50 people every year. They start the program, and by the time they're done, they have a bachelor's degree in how to study human tissue samples.
I would say if you went to Portland Metro, it would have been impossible, at least during my time there, because many of the times they were manning the front desk quite often. So at least somebody from the MLS
Yeah.
school was always at the front desk, it seemed. So
It's the degree program that's always fully enrolled,
mm-hmm.
and they have 100% graduation rate, and they have 100% placement rate.
Yeah, it's like one of
There's
the
no one
most
who,
highly sought after programs within at least Oregon, I
yeah,
believe, or it might be the only MLS program in Oregon. I don't
it's
know. Is it taught at OHSU?
well, that's where our collaboration, and we collaborate with OHSU to provide this degree
Oh,
program.
well, there you go.
So the reason that we were looking at this chemistry analyzer, which is just a great big beige box to the layperson,
Yeah.
is because the professor who teaches the topics in chemistry analysis has to do maintenance on this machine. And she realized that if she was going to be the only person doing maintenance on it, because she can't trust me to do it, I've got aquatic mammal flippers for hands. I can't do work on this thing. I'm out. It's outside of my experience. Then she was going to have a lot of more work to do than she really had budget, than she could budget time for. So her brilliant idea is to train the students coming through the MLS program how to perform maintenance on these machines,
Ooh,
because they're the ones that are going to encounter this in the field.
absolutely. Very good.
So she showed us a couple of the features of this machine, and let me just say that there are expensive consumables. So these are the reagents and parts of the machine that get used up when you're running tests. And the expensive consumables include things like probes that are $800 a piece. And all you have to do is put a improperly prepared blood sample into the analyzer to mess the entire thing up.
Oh, geez.
So you would have a cascading maintenance problem if someone put a bad sample in, one, or two, if you're not getting the readings that you would expect from it, then you have to go in and investigate the different subsystems to make sure that they're working properly. She wants to teach her students this. So there's an MLS faculty in this meeting, and there's a mechanical engineering faculty in the meeting, and the student is from the electrical engineering program.
Okay.
And what we're going to do is run a pilot this year where that student is going to use 3D modeling software to design features of this chemistry analyzer. Not the entire thing, but just features of it that then we can take back to the MLS students and give to them as dexterity trainers.
Okay. That's pretty cool.
The whole idea here is we have faculty from two wildly different disciplines, medical laboratory science, different college entirely,
Yeah.
and mechanical engineering. So our mechanical engineering faculty is a material scientist. And then the student could be from any department, frankly. They just need to know how to drive a CAD box.
Yeah.
And so the student is going to take instructions and have a framework with the two faculty to create these different pieces and parts of a chemistry analyzer, and then build into it the features that the students will use to train on how to perform these repairs and inspections.
That is so cool.
What I've just described for you is nearly the ideal academic collaboration for nearly the ideal academic project to teach nearly every one of the subject matter topics that we teach.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
and something like that is exactly what I was, alluding to.
It's material science. It's material science. It's manufacturing science.
Mm-hmm.
It's the mathematics that goes into setting up parameters in designs. It's using scalability factors. It's everything you could possibly want, up to and including the polar to rectangular notation conversion. But it's all of the things that go into the most meaningful engineering enterprise, which is not only to create the instrumentation, which has already been done, but to create the instrumentation that trains people on how to use the instrumentation.
Yeah.
Which is an even more, in some ways, more sophisticated problem, because if you just use the thing that people are that instrument that is operated in the lab, you run into the issue of its sensitivity being easy to get out of range, and you can break off these sensitive or these probes or whatever, these fragile probes. And so what we can actually do with the design of the training feature is to make it even more fragile.
Yeah.
Or give feedback on whether or not something is aligned or not. So we're not actually copying part for part the chemistry analyzer. We're making a game of operation out of a piece of
so that
medical lab science equipment.
Be more careful with the actual equipment once they have it. Okay.
So this is an opportunity for Internet of Things and embedded systems devices to be implemented into it, so that it has a buzzer or some type of warning that you're out of spec.
Yeah.
Right? We could actually build in very cheap consumables that break off really easily, so that when these, by the way, you can do almost anything with your bare hands. These students have to do it with nitrile gloves on.
Oh my God.
So they're going to be doing all this. Ones. Yeah, they're going to be encumbered already. So if they're working with this stuff and it breaks off, it's no sweat, but they also got a 0 on that particular part of the exam.
Yeah.
They know what to retest or what to train for. So I wish that we could do things like this throughout the entire educational spectrum.
Yeah.
From the very beginning on, because it would build into every level of academics less how to sit still for 8 hours or less how to train for an exam, or less how to do the things that we currently would indict our education system for, and much more about the desirable outcomes of our actions and ways to study things in a way that quantifies quickly what's wrong, troubleshooting, and what can fix it. And that's what's going to come from this project. If we do it right, we'll probably have about 10 years of projects that can come off of this one idea.
Yeah, that's really promising. I think what you're talking about sounds complicated on the onset, but I think it actually just requires collaboration from different educators, and obviously the willingness within whatever administration to kind of have a little bit of risk and vision
Right.
behind their motivation when it comes to advancing our education. So it looks like the hour is upon us. It's proceeded. We're already past the hour as time is flowing right by. So this has been just another joyful conversation with you. I liked it very much. Man, we traversed quite a mini subject and ended in education.
Well, we got from quantum entanglement to the specifics about how we test human blood.
Jeez, so much that I don't know about. Anyways, it's been really a pleasure. So with that, I'm going to say thanks to everybody. Don't forget to subscribe and like, share us with your friends and family. This wasn't very veteran-y today. It was just two veterans talking about a bunch of stuff. So
Probably a broader appeal than you might expect.
yeah.
If I didn't
Anyways,
lose everybody with the quantum entanglement talk.
never. All right. Well, thanks. And as always, take care, Richard.
Good to talk to you, Pierce. I'll see you next time.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.